everybody, I'm Rick Beato. This is Red Shull and Dave Honorato. Welcome to Everything Music. Today we're not going to trash guitar companies. We're going to talk about something that I like to talk about, which is what happened to rock music. Specifically, we're going to discuss how the loss of blues-influenced music led to the decline of rock as a worldwide music phenomenon. Now, I was born in 1962, Dave was born in 71, Rhett was born in 1990. When I was growing up, I heard the Beatles, I heard the Stones, I heard the Who, I heard Led Zeppelin. When I was a kid, all the 60s bands, Jimi Hendrix, you name it. All those bands were influenced by blues.
Yeah, I had pretty much the same references. Maybe some of the later stuff like Boston and Van Halen and some of that, but those were all blues influenced too. With the British invasion, in the early 60s, like 63, 64, you had all those bands come over here. And at the time, the popular music in America was all surf music and Motown, and like Spector's Wall of Sound. The British bands came over and had the blues influenced stuff, and that's why they sounded so different. That's why I think everybody went so crazy about it, because it was like, wow, what is this? It was like they took Elvis and they took Little Richard and Chuck Berry and all that stuff in the 50s, and also a whole bunch of other blues records like Howlin' Wolf and all the early B.B. King stuff, Freddie King, all the Chicago Delta stuff, of course Robert Johnson and all the early 20s stuff. They really were like fiends for that stuff over there. And also all those bands in that little microcosmic center, between the Stones and the Kinks and all those guys, obviously the Beatles, they all listen to the same records because they were all playing the same clubs. They were all passing the same records around going, hey, are you hip to this? Are you hip to that? And if you read interviews with all those guys, man, they're all like, who was the coolest? If you had the coolest records, you were the coolest person.
Right.
It didn't matter if you were good or not. You were just so cool that everybody wanted to hang out with you because you had those records. They couldn't get them. So, even Keith Richards says that in multiple interviews. He was like, I hung out with Jagger because Jagger had all the cool records. That's how we met. They were like on a train, and supposedly he looks over and Jagger's got this thing of records, and he's like, he's got Howlin' Wolf, he's got Jimmy Reed. He's like, who is this guy? I got to know who this guy is. That's how they formed the band. So obviously it was such a small little microcosm of people that they all kind of influenced each other. But it was all the same records being passed around, and it was all the records that everybody here in the States weren't listening to. It was all artists that they had forgotten about, passed up, mainly because they were black artists. And if you did hear some of that, it was by white artists who re-recorded songs, Pat Boone and these type people who would re-record a lot of these blues tunes and make them popular, and which did somewhat help the black artists in some, if they were lucky enough to get some royalties, it did help them a little bit. Bo Diddley and some other people actually got some notoriety from white artists covering their stuff, but so basically you had these English guys who came over who were fanatics for blues artists, and when they came over, they couldn't wait to get here because most of the guys said they wanted to come and see the real blues artists.
Well, they were literally doing blues tunes.
Yeah.
If you talk about not just the Beatles, but you get to Led Zeppelin, the Stones. They were...
Oh, they picked like 10 records and made careers out of them.
Right.
And they're, the one thing I will say about that, most of those guys did acknowledge where they got it from, and were like, they tried to help the artists that they did take songs from, and put them on tour with them, or at least try to shine light on them.
Yeah.
And if they couldn't do it in America, they took them to England and got
people like Eric Clapton would they would have these friendships.
Yeah, they took Howlin' Wolf and all those guys over to England, and those guys over there became huge, artists in England, solely on the basis of that small microcosmic of like 5-6 bands going, hey, these are the guys you really should listen to. And so they were lucky enough to have enough money to bring them back and sometimes and get them to play over there. And that's how they had their careers. And all of those guys, like Albert King, Freddie King, who I'm a huge fan of, all said, if it wasn't for those English kids, we wouldn't have had careers. We would have died out in the 60s, and it probably would have never happened for us. So they were able to kind of cultivate their careers up until the 90s, when they unfortunately started dying off. But
now there was definitely a bump in the road for rock music and blues in the early 70s with all the acoustic music that was coming out, bands like Bread and America, but there were still blues influences in in some of these bands, Jim
Yeah.
Croce and Gordon
definitely.
Lightfoot and Harry
Sure.
Chapin, they
Sure.
still
Yes.
retain blues.
Yeah.
Then you hit the mid-'70s and you had disco, but immediately following that you had the punk movement and new wave movements.
Right, and you could argue whether that was a raw form of blues.
Right.
That was going back to the guttural. I can't play guitar, but I'm gonna play 3 chords and I'm gonna scream because my life sucks and I got to do something. And it's the same principle basis of all good blues.
Then we go through the '80s. We're not up to where Rhett's been born yet, so he can't really talk about this.
Sorry.
So then we get to the '80s, and pretty much most of '80s metal, starting with Van Halen in the late '70s, was still all blues influence.
Completely.
The Police, bands like that, even
reggae too.
were reggae
blues,
and they had blues melodies. So a lot of Sting's melodies were just blues melodies, and a lot of the riffs were blues.
And he sang.
He sang blues.
Right. He tried to sing like that.
Yeah.
I mean, he even said, he's like, it's funny because Sting was always like, I hate the way I sing, but a lot of people really like it, so I must be doing something right. But he said, I listen. He was a huge jazz musician, so he listened to all the original Sarah Vaughan and all those classic blues and R&B and jazz singers. So it all came from the same spot.
So all the way through the '80s, almost every '80s metal band was blues influenced.
Yeah.
And then you get into the early '90s, and we have the grunge movement. I mean, in the early, you have those transitionary bands like Guns N' Roses that were very blues influenced, and Jane's Addiction, things like that. But then all grunge was, for the most part, all blues influenced because the guys were born in the early '60s, like I was. You had Kurt Cobain doing a cover of In the Pines, Leadbelly. You had Pearl Jam doing Yellow Ledbetter, sounds like a Jimi Hendrix tune. I mean, a lot of Pearl Jam's riffs were right out of blues. Their solos were blues oriented. Soundgarden's licks were blues oriented. A lot of Alice in Chains vocal melodies had blues influences in them. Yeah. And then the mid '90s happened, and Rhett was born, early '90s, and maybe it has something to do with Rhett, but blues started to leave rock, and rock stopped becoming a dominant force. I say around 1994 was the beginning of it. When I say a dominant force, I mean that rock bands were big worldwide. In 1992, when Nirvana and Pearl Jam were at the top of the charts here in the United States, they were huge in South America, in Europe, in Japan, everywhere. They were a worldwide force. Today, when you think of worldwide forces, you think of people like Beyonce or Adele. Those are, but who are both blues-influenced singers. I mean, Adele and Beyonce both. In the 90s, you started to have bands like Dave Matthews, Hootie and the Blowfish, and then right in 97, you started getting Limp Bizkit and Creed and the beginnings of nu metal. And I contend that nu metal was devoid of blues influence for the most part. Not all. I mean, Rage Against the Machine was in the early 90s, and then they made the transition and then became Audio Slave after Zach left the band and they reformed. But all of their riffs in Rage were all blues oriented, Zeppelin-esque.
Yeah, that whole Chili Peppers and Faith No More and those bands were all still derivative of. There was always that Zeppelin element somewhere. There was always definitely a blues feel to them.
But when Rhett was starting to, when he was a kid, and you started getting all these early 2000s faceless bands, the Puddle of Mud, Chevelle, other bands we won't mention, bands where you didn't know any of the people in the band.
Well, the other thing too is by the time I was like becoming a conscious human being and realizing what music was in the mid to late 90s, that's the first major movement in music that I remember were the boy bands. 98 Degrees, NSYNC, Backstreet Boys. I was in third grade, fourth grade, and those were the records that kids around my time were talking about. And those, same thing, those are pretty much all devoid of any influence of blues, Yeah. And so, but the way I grew up, my parents, the first music I remember listening to in the house were the 70s and 80s funk bands. So Earth, Wind and Fire, Gap Band, Cameo, Rick James, which is very heavily blues influenced. And so when I started getting into music on my own, fruition and started finding out what I liked, I went straight to the blues. The first record I ever bought with my own money was the Jimi Hendrix blues compilation, which we were just talking about, is kind of a hodgepodge of Hendrix stuff, but that's what led me to, I mean, literally, I remember where I was the first time I heard Red House off that record. I can take you back to the exact spot. I was like 12 years old in the back of my parents' car with my little Sony CD player, and it blew my mind. And that's what got me into guitar. Hendrix got me into guitar.
Yeah,
you know, nobody in my family's a musician. I didn't come from players or anything, and it was that which kind of opened up my world.
I can remember the lick that started guitar for me, and it was Albert King, Livewire Blues Power, 68 live record. My father had it, and I heard it, and I just was like, what is that? You know, it was like this bomb going off. Same with, Red House. I had the first 2 Hendrix records, you know, just mind-blowing, you know. And as a little kid, you know, you're innocent, so you know that stuff is true blue, man, because it cuts through the BS. It's like, as a kid, if you hear something, go, that's it. That's it. It's like there's no, you don't have a formed opinion. You're so blown away by like, what is that? You know. So it's like, you know, that kind of stuff. It's like, man, okay, for life. I mean, you know,
because it's vocal.
It is. It's all vocal.
And if we go back and trace the origins of the blues, I mean, it goes all the way back to slavery and field hollers. I mean, when slaves were picking cotton.
Pain, man. It's out of pain. Yeah.
And it's a uniquely American thing, you know, blues, and then from blues, jazz. I mean, that all comes from probably the darkest time in American history, and so that's why it resonates with everybody. I mean, that line that you just played, it's so painful and soulful. And
that's somebody crying. That's somebody's soul being like, I can't take it anymore, and I got to just, you know, let it out. And that's what it is. And I think, you know, that's kind of partly what we're talking about here, is that music now, it's plastic. It's not that. There are people who are trying to do it. I'm not saying that's everybody across the board. There are really good bands doing some of that. But as a whole, especially commercially, it's like that's been taken out of that element is gone. It's almost like the corporation said, you know what, that's real, we don't want that.
Right.
Because that's actually has some human element. You know, it's like it's the whole, you know, human.
I mean, really, the whole EDM movement is devoid of any blues, obviously.
It is.
And a lot of the electronic music that's pop music is devoid of blues. It's all been auto-tuned. Everything is been...
There's no human element.
It's been stripped of its humanity.
Right.
And if you want to look on a commercial, as far as commercial success, the most successful artist of the last 10 years, you look at Adele, for example, that is really, especially the first 2 albums, you know, they are all blues melodies.
It's Aretha Franklin.
People wonder, why did 21 sell 10 million copies? And I was like, well, it's a blues record.
It is.
Rock people still like the blues.
It's Aretha Franklin, Etta James, you know, Tina Turner. It's all of that element. It's that, you know, and she knew that. I mean, you could tell by her voice before they slicked her all out. She brought it. You know, people were so bombarded with other plastic garbage that's just totally came out of nowhere. You know, people are like, what is that? You know, it's blues, man. It's real. It's like, that's the element that we all kind of gravitate toward because we know it. You know, every human being has had crappy days, gone through pain, has been pissed off. That's what music is. You express that out in music, and when you take that out of it, what do you have? You have this just plastic Muzak garbage in the background for a commercial.
So if you look at artists that have been successful in the last, let's say, 18 years, since 2000, you talked about people like John Mayer that have a lot of blues elements. Obviously, I mean, he's a blues guitar player. Justin Timberlake.
Yes.
And Beyonce.
By proxy of Justin Timberlake, Chris Stapleton now. You know, a lot of these modern country guys are Sturgill Simpson. You know, these guys that are kind of not taking over. Well, I guess Stapleton is in a way taking over country music and sort of leading the force of taking it back from bro country.
Yeah, he's
Southern
kind of
pop,
been the forefront of turning it at least 180 and going, okay, look, we got to get back to something.
which is going back to that same thing. You know, I think part of the big, and it's hard to say country music is declining because it's still so commercially successful and there's still so many people that are selling records, all these major artists, but these songs don't stick around long term because they're super polished, super commercial, super safe. I think it's really what, if we boil it down to it, that's what we're talking about. If, you know, right around the time that blues left rock is also around the time that the internet took over and the music business took a
Pro Tools
hit.
took over everything.
And so there's a correlation there in my mind where now industry executives and record labels are saying, well, we have to play it safe, and we know this sells. We know this polished, auto-tuned, shiny thing sells, but we're not sure if this raw, you know, sad.
So they don't want to take a chance.
They don't want to take a chance on it. So people listen to, you know, and by people I don't mean like musicians, people that like dig into music. I mean people that just listen to the radio in their car and buy whatever's on top 40 or listen to whatever's on top 40. They're going to listen to whatever you stream on their FM radio. And so that's why some of these artists are so popular nowadays, is because that's all the masses are hearing, is this super polished pop thing, which is devoid of a lot of soul and feeling, with some major exceptions. Bruno Mars, right? Mm-hmm. Bruno Mars, especially his live show, is like kind of James Brown.
I was gonna say it's kind of James Brown, like a Prince kind of thing.
Right, exactly. Prince, you know, but those artists are still popular.
Yeah.
Like, you know, Aretha Franklin, all these artists from the 60s and 70s are still popular, and new generation, like, man, I found the blues and I found rock and stuff when I was a kid who was born in 90. I was definitely not alive when any of that stuff was first popular, but I found it, and it's had such an influence on me because of its prevalence and because its power.
Yeah.
So one of the other things that happened in the 90s was in 1996, the Telecommunications Act of 1996 that Bill Clinton signed, which essentially made these mega corporations took over all the media. Right now it's probably about 5 or 6 these mega media corporations that control everything that we read, watch, and listen to. And this homogenization of music began right at that time. That's the time period, 1996, and I'm talking about.
Yeah.
That mixed with, as Rhett just said, Pro Tools. And when you get Pro Tools, you got Auto-Tune and then Melodyne. And then you started to have, and that happened really, the transition when everyone started using Pro Tools was right around 2000, 99 to 2000, when the Mix Plus system came out. And then you started to have the gridification of all music, not just rock, all pop music. Everything was tuned, everything was put to a grid, a time grid and a pitch grid. You can't have blues if you are on a pitch grid. You can't.
No.
There's nothing perfect about blues, man.
No.
Nothing.
Why would you want perfect blues? And if you hear perfect blues, you go, that's not blues. Right. So you can't do it. Like a perfect example, I always tell people, like, would you really want to hear a Stones record corrected?
No. Put on someone's probably done it.
Put on Exile Main Street and correct it.
Oh God.
What do you got? I mean, it's like, come on.
Makes me cringe.
Right. So right there, you take out the human element.
So those two things, the corporatization of playlists with these of radio with these huge companies like Clear Channel and Cumulus that took over and bought up all these radio stations, and then would have one person programming all the rock stations.
For example,
take
with the human element. Get rid of a DJ that actually has
taste,
some hipness, and like, hey, I want to hip people to some new stuff. Oh, you can't do that.
Do you remember in back when Bittersweet Symphony came out and on 99X, the DJ played it 8 times in a row, and that was
they built that song.
Exactly. I remember driving in my car when that happened.
Yeah.
And Axel was the DJ, and he said, "Wow, I love that song. I'm going to play it again."
Yeah.
Then it played it. He goes, "I'm going to play it again." He played it 8 times straight. Bittersweet Symphony. Individuals. Leslie Fram that ran 99X here, she took chances on bands. I mean, not just Not just major label bands, on local bands.
No,
even.
that was to me, that was the last station that somebody tried to be like, you know what, we're going to try to do it old school and let the DJs dictate some stuff and let management dictate what's going on and let the listeners dictate what's going on. Hey, call in. If you like this song, call in and we'll play. If not, you don't have that. When you homogenize everything, this is what you get.
Well, I remember, so I was young, but I remember 96 Rock here in town, and I remember the day it changed from 96 Rock to Project 961, which was like, new metal station. Right. And then a few years ago, they even dropped that to now it's Power 961, and it's a Billboard Top 40. So now there's not even good stations around, and 96 Rock was like a cornerstone rock station here in Atlanta.
Yeah, when I moved here in 90,
years.
That was the big rock station.
Right.
It was like, if it was on 96, that was it.
In the 70s, when I was a kid, there were stations in upstate New York, like WCMF in Rochester, that, bands like Rush wouldn't exist if it wasn't for all these upstate New York and places like Cleveland that were
WMMS, the Buzzard, dude, they broke Rush. In fact, they made their career, and they even say it in a lot of documentaries that it was like, if it wasn't for WMMS, we wouldn't have been anywhere near, because it was a one DJ. He played the first couple of things, and he kept playing it, and he didn't, he just was like, I just really like this, so I'm going to keep playing it. And within 2 weeks, man, they were like on tour, and then they got picked up by a management company, I think, and then they toured with Kiss, and they started opening up for So strictly because a DJ was cool enough to go, you know what, this deserves to be on the radio, and if they're going to let me play it, I'm going to do it. And we don't have that. So what we have now is we have all people searching the internet to find cool bands, and there's stations that do, but if you really got to dig. You really got to dig to find stuff.
Now Spotify is the modern. It's the one station to rule them all, essentially.
Yep.
And whatever spot. Now because as someone like I'm working in the industry, like with bands who are trying to break, and the thing what everybody's going for now is to try and get placed on a Spotify playlist. Right. Like that's the thing. That's the new radio. That's the new spin on a radio is, man, if I can get on this top 40 playlist, or if I can get on this whoever playlist.
Yep.
I know people who are in bands that have built tours around Spotify plays. There's a band, Wolfpack, who's an amazing funk killer band, where they actually gamed Spotify a couple years ago, where they put out a record of 10 tracks that were all silent and no music on them whatsoever. And they reached out. They had a relatively small fan base at the time, I think, but they told everybody to just put it on and let it play. And they made, I think, like over $20,000, and they funded a whole tour where I hope I'm not butchering this, but every show was free admission for their fans, and it was game Spotify system.
New tactics to make it happen. That tactic in itself, that's old school, man. That's like, like, okay, how are we going to make it happen? It's grassroots. So there again, it's back to the blues. It's like, strip it all down. What really works? And I'm not under the belief that people don't want to go see live music. I get a lot of people, nobody wants to go see live music anymore. That's why it's dying out. And they got too many distractions. I think at the end of the day, if it's handed to them right and it's something that's genuine, they'll come see it.
Yeah.
Okay? Yes, there's an element that won't. There's an element that's always going to be sitting in front of the computer, and it doesn't matter if you paid them $20,000, they wouldn't leave the house. But
people appreciate authenticity.
They do.
And there's an authenticity about most live music, and especially bands that are keeping that blues influence alive. Bands like Alabama Shakes.
Yep.
Even guys like Jack White, who he's built a huge career on 3 or 4 different bands that are all blues. The Raconteurs, Dead Weather, his solo stuff, the White Stripes. Those are all blues bands, right?
Well, and Black Keys.
Black Keys, yes, they're a blues band. And so going back to what we were talking about earlier, that sort of tradition of American bands going over to Europe, because Europeans appreciate music, and especially American music, on a different level than we do here at home. Yeah. Kings of Leon, Black Keys. These bands went and broke in Europe and then came back over like Hendrix did.
Dude, like the Rival Sons.
I used
to go see them, 8-10 years ago, and they were, 50 people at the show, and now they're selling out. They're opening up for the Stones.
Yeah.
You know, they just opened the last Stones store, and I mean, they're killing it, man. And they deserve it because they're keeping it real. They're keeping it traditional.
And my friends, I'll give them a shout out. Tyler Bryant and the Shakedown. They're doing the exact same thing.
Yeah.
You know, they're killing it and just spending so much time out on the road and just put out a really great record. But yeah, they go over to Europe. And
Okay,
kill it.
so is there really hope for rock music to become a worldwide force again, though?
There's two schools of thought the way I see it. One school of thought is because of the internet, because of Spotify, everyone's so fragmented now. Everyone's in their own little niche. They have your own playlist of your own stuff. And so from that perspective, through that lens, then yes, you could say, well, no, nobody's ever going to have a Nirvana again. The other thing to think about is between now and 2020, in the next 2 years, there's going to be another, I think, 3 to 5 billion people that are coming online for the first time.
Right.
So this internet pool that everybody's swimming in now is about to get a lot bigger. And so for bands that are on Spotify and Apple Music and YouTube is a huge platform for music and for people discovering music. I mean, think about that Korean artist a few years ago, Psy, who had that massive song,
Gangnam Style.
I mean, that hit because of YouTube.
That's right.
You know,
We're on YouTube right now.
Yeah,
exactly.
Right.
Yeah, which shows what I mean. Honestly, like we believe in this platform. I believe in this platform.
Yeah,
it's a viable platform. So, in my perspective, I think you could, but I think the more likely answer is things are going to continue to be more fragmented. But again, from as a musician's perspective, even if you have a smaller slice of that pie, even if you never are a Nirvana, you know, they're on YouTube right now. There's 1 billion users that come on.
Okay, so this is a segue into this issue that I've had that people have heard me talk about, which is the blockers of YouTube. I've done this series called "What Makes This Song Great," that many of you are watching because of that series, and I have these bands like Fleetwood Mac or Queens of the Stone Age, both that are blues influenced, that block these videos that I make that are essentially telling people that this is a commercial for their music. And a lot of the bands that I can't make videos of, like Led Zeppelin, the Beatles, these people that are blockers of YouTube. I mean, Prince has really been a blocker, and I mean.
Now, is it the artist or is it the lawyers?
Well, we don't know. I've talked to record labels this week. I've talked to publishing companies, and honestly, they don't know. I talked to a publisher this week, major publisher friend of mine. I talked to a senior.
I would venture to say
they don't know.
It's the legal end of things.
No, I think it's the artists are telling them. Yeah, because everyone makes deals. Led Zeppelin was one of the last groups to come on Spotify and come on Apple Music.
Yeah.
And they don't allow anything on YouTube that's not sanctioned by them. So I think it's specifically the artists. I may be wrong. If there's any of you artists out there that are watching this, Jimmy Page, if you're out there, we love you.
Yes.
Please
come on the show.
Please let me do a proper video on how great Led Zeppelin is. Okay. Anyways.
And bring your burst so we can play.
Yeah, please.
Yes,
please. You know, I thought about this overnight. We filmed the video last night, and I started thinking about it this morning that one thing that I left out of the video that we didn't talk about, that I was personally involved with, is how A&R people at labels, starting around 2002 or so, when the music industry started to really began on its steep decline as far as their revenue model was concerned, is that A&R people would hire producers to not only write the music with the bands, but even write the lyrics and perform some of the music. I would be hired to play on records, help the people write the songs or co-write the songs. And I would ask the people, why don't you just find people that could write their own songs? Why don't you just sign artists that could write their own songs? And that seems like a really obvious thing, but that's not what happened. They would find people, they bring in producers and say, you're going to write with this 50-year-old producer, you're going to write, the artists are going to write with them, and these people are helping them write their lyrics. I mean, it was ridiculous to me. And I said, just find people that can write their own music, like has always happened. So it was that, and you had this new metal movement had the same couple producers that produced all the records. You had the same mixers on all of them, and you had the same few producers that produced all the records. Labels did not want to take a chance, because if you signed something that failed and you spent a lot of money on it, you lost your job. You can look up who these people are. And I always wondered, I wasn't one of these people. I didn't make all these records, but there's a couple producers that made a lot of the records in the early 2000s. They all sound the same. They were made with the same amplifiers, they were made with the same songwriters. They would do 4 bars at a time. They would loop it. And this whole assembly line of rock music began to happen, where all the stuff was auto-tuned, all of it was gridded, all the drums were gridded to the 16th note, and all the soul was taken out of the music, including the lack of blues. You can't have auto-tune and blues together. It just does not work. So I just wanted to add that other piece of this and say that was no question part of the decline of rock music. Anyways, I'd like to thank Dave and Rhett for being my guests, and remind you to subscribe here to my Everything Music YouTube channel. If you're interested in my Beato book, which helps support this channel, go to my website at www.rickbeato.com, and you can find it there. Thanks for watching.